Sarah had always felt like an outsider in the Morrison family. Ever since she married David 3 years ago, his father, William Morrison, had treated her with cold politeness at best and barely concealed disdain at worst. The man who had built a financial empire from nothing seemed to view her as nothing more than a gold digger who had somehow ensnared his beloved son. So when David received the call that his father was in the hospital, dying of pancreatic cancer with only weeks to live, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions she couldn't quite untangle. The Morrison mansion stood like a fortress against the gray November sky, its imposing columns and manicured gardens a testament to decades of accumulated wealth. Sarah had only been here twice before, once for their engagement party, where William had given the most lukewarm toast imaginable, and once for David's birthday, where she'd spent most of the evening feeling like she was being evaluated and found wanting. Now, as she walked up the marble steps alone, her heels clicking against the stone, she wondered why she had insisted on coming to visit William by herself. David was buried in meetings, trying to keep the family business running while his father lay dying, and someone needed to check on the old man. The butler, Edward, greeted her with surprise. In all his 40 years of service to the Morrison family, he had never seen Sarah arrive without David. There was something different about her today, a determination in her brown eyes that hadn't been there before, a straightness to her shoulders that spoke of resolve rather than the nervous tension she usually carried in this house. Edward led her through the familiar halls lined with oil paintings of Morrison ancestors, their stern faces seeming to judge her as she passed. William Morrison lay propped up in his enormous four-poster bed, looking smaller than Sarah had ever seen him. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and struck fear into competitors now appeared fragile, his skin pale and thin like parchment. But his steel-gray eyes still held their sharp intelligence, and when he saw Sarah enter his bedroom, those eyes widened with genuine surprise. He had been expecting David, or perhaps his lawyer, or any number of business associates who had been trooping through his room for weeks. He had not expected his daughter-in-law, the woman he had spent 3 years keeping at arm's length. "Sarah," he said, his voice weaker than she remembered, but still carrying that authoritative tone that had intimidated her for so long. "This is unexpected. Where is David?" She moved closer to his bedside, noting how the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows seemed to highlight every line of fatigue and pain on his face. For the first time since she had known him, William Morrison looked every one of his 72 years. "He's handling the Peterson merger," she replied, settling into the leather chair beside his bed. "The one you've been working on for months. He didn't want to leave, but I told him someone should come check on you." William studied her face, searching for the ulterior motive he was certain must be there. In his experience, people didn't do things without reason, especially not people he had treated as poorly as he had treated Sarah. But her expression remained open, genuinely concerned in a way that caught him off guard. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 3 years of awkward dinners, stilted conversations, and carefully polite interactions that had fooled no one. Sarah found herself really looking at her father-in-law for perhaps the first time, seeing past the intimidating exterior to the man underneath. He had built everything from nothing, David had told her, growing up in poverty before clawing his way to the top of the financial world. But what did any of that success mean now, as he lay dying in this enormous house, surrounded by expensive things but so terribly alone? William's eyes remained fixed on Sarah's face, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that had been troubling him for years. The machines beside his bed beeped softly, marking time in a room that felt suspended between past and present. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying a weight that made Sarah lean forward slightly to catch every word. "You know, I've been lying here for weeks, watching people come and go. Business partners, lawyers, distant relatives who suddenly remember they care about me now that I'm dying." His laugh was bitter, tinged with the kind of cynicism that comes from a lifetime of dealing with people who want something from you. But you're the first person who's come here without an agenda. The first person who's looked at me like I'm actually human instead of just a dying checkbook. Sarah felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. She had prepared herself for another awkward visit, another series of polite exchanges that would leave both of them feeling worse than when they started. She hadn't expected this moment of raw honesty from a man who had spent 3 years treating her like she was invisible. "Mr. Morrison, I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, but you're David's father. Your family." Family. William repeated the word slowly, as if tasting something foreign. "Do you know what I thought when David first brought you home? I thought you were like all the others, the women who had circled around him in college, attracted to the Morrison name and the Morrison money. Beautiful, charming, and ultimately calculating." He paused, studying her reaction. Sarah felt her cheeks flush, but she didn't look away. She had suspected as much, but hearing it stated so bluntly still stung. "I hired a private investigator," William continued, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "I had him dig into your background, your family, your motivations. I was certain I would find evidence that you were after David's inheritance, that you were playing some kind of long game." He reached for the glass of water on his bedside table with trembling hands, and without thinking, Sarah moved to help him, holding the glass steady as he drank. The simple gesture seemed to affect William more than any grand proclamation could have. Here was this woman he had treated with suspicion and coldness, helping him with the basic dignity of drinking water. When he finished, he looked at her with something that might have been shame flickering in his eyes. The investigator came back with the most boring report I'd ever seen. Sarah Chun, elementary school teacher, modest savings account, student loans, takes care of her elderly mother. No criminal record, no suspicious associations, no evidence of gold-digging behavior whatsoever. Sarah sat back in her chair, processing this revelation. For 3 years, she had wondered why William seemed to see right through her, why every conversation felt like an interrogation, why she could never quite measure up to his expectations. Now she understood. He had been looking for evidence of deception that simply didn't exist, and her very genuineness had somehow made him more suspicious, not less. "But even then, I couldn't let go of my doubts," William admitted, his voice growing softer. "I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for you to reveal your true colors. I watched you at family dinners, analyzed every word you said, every gesture you made. I was so determined to protect David from what I was certain was coming that I never stopped to consider that maybe, just maybe, you loved him for exactly who he was." The afternoon light was fading now, casting long shadows across the ornate bedroom. Sarah could hear the distant sounds of the household staff going about their duties, preparing dinner that William would barely touch, maintaining routines that felt increasingly hollow as the master of the house grew weaker each day. She thought about all the times she had tried to connect with this man, all the conversations that had died before they could begin, all the moments when she had felt like she was failing some test she didn't even know she was taking. "I need to tell you something," William said suddenly, his voice taking on an urgency that made Sarah's pulse quicken. "Something I should have told you years ago. Something that changes everything you think you know about this family, about David, about why I've kept you at such a distance." His eyes were intense now, burning with the kind of fierce determination that had built his empire, and Sarah realized that whatever he was about to say would alter the course of her life forever. William's hands trembled as he reached into the drawer of his nightstand, pulling out a warm manila envelope that looked like it had been handled countless times over the years. The paper was yellowed at the edges, and Sarah could see that her name was written across the front in William's distinctive handwriting, though the ink had faded with time. Her heart began to race as she realized this envelope had been prepared long before his current illness, perhaps years ago. "Before I tell you what's in here, I need you to understand something about the kind of man I am," William began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of carefully guarded secrets. "I built this fortune through calculation, through always being 3 steps ahead of everyone else, through never letting emotion cloud my judgment. But there was one decision I made 30 years ago that wasn't based on business sense or strategic thinking. It was based on love, and it's haunted me every single day since. Sarah watched as William's facade began to crumble, revealing a vulnerability she had never imagined existed beneath his cold exterior. The powerful businessman who had intimidated her for years suddenly looked like nothing more than an old man, carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear. She found herself leaning forward, drawn into whatever revelation was about to unfold. When I was 25, I fell in love with a woman named Lynn Shun, William continued, and Sarah felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. The surname hit her like a physical blow, and she gripped the arms of her chair to steady herself. She was the most beautiful, intelligent, compassionate person I had ever met. She worked as a translator for international businesses, and we met when she was helping my company negotiate a deal with a Chinese manufacturing firm. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity, but Sarah's mind refused to accept what her heart already knew. William's eyes never left her face as he continued his story, watching her expressions change from confusion to dawning realization to something approaching shock. Lynn was everything I wasn't, warm where I was cold, generous where I was calculating, open where I was guarded. She saw the best in everyone, believed that people were fundamentally good. She believed in love over logic, and for a brief, shining moment, she made me believe in it too. Sarah's mouth fell dry as she whispered, "What happened to her?" But even as she asked the question, she knew the answer would shatter everything she thought she knew about her own life, her own identity, her own family history. William's voice broke slightly as he continued. My father was still alive then, still the head of the Morrison Empire, and he was even more ruthless than I ever became. When he found out about Lynn, he gave me an ultimatum: end the relationship immediately, or be cut off from the family fortune forever. He said a Morrison couldn't be associated with those people, couldn't risk the family's reputation or business interests in Asia. The hatred in William's voice as he quoted his father was palpable, decades of resentment and regret crystallizing into those few bitter words. I was young and stupid and convinced that I could have both, the woman I loved and the empire I was born to inherit. So I tried to keep our relationship secret while I figured out a way to change my father's mind. But Lynn was proud, fiercely independent, and when she realized I was ashamed to be seen with her in public, when she understood that I was choosing my family's money over our future together, she left. William's hand shook as he opened the envelope, and Sarah could see tears gathering in his eyes for the first time since she had known him. She disappeared from my life completely, changed jobs, moved away, refused to take my calls or answer my letters. And 6 months later, I learned through a private investigator that she was pregnant. The silence that followed this revelation was deafening, broken only by the steady beeping of William's medical equipment and the sound of Sarah's increasingly rapid breathing. I tried to find her, tried to do the right thing, but she had vanished completely. And eventually, I convinced myself that maybe it was for the best. I told myself that I could provide better opportunities, a better life, better education for a child raised as a Morrison rather than struggling in poverty with a single mother. William pulled out a photograph from the envelope, his hands trembling so badly that Sarah had to help him hold it steady. The photograph showed a young Asian woman holding a baby, both of them smiling at the camera with joy that radiated from the old print. But it was the woman's face that made Sarah's world collapse entirely. It was her own face, 28 years younger, looking back at her with eyes full of love and hope and dreams for the future. Sarah stared at the photograph with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The woman in the picture had her same almond-shaped eyes, the same delicate bone structure, the same gentle smile that David always said reminded him of sunshine. But this couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. The woman she had called mother her entire life, the woman who had raised her with such love and sacrifice, couldn't have been lying to her for 28 years. Her name was Lynn Shun. William continued, his voice barely above a whisper now. But after you were born, she changed it to Linda Chun. She wanted to give you every opportunity to fit into American society, to never face the kind of discrimination she had experienced. She anglicized her own name, learned to speak English without an accent, worked 3 jobs to put herself through nursing school so she could provide for you. The room seemed to be spinning around Sarah as memories flooded back with new context. Her mother's reluctance to talk about Sarah's father, always changing the subject when Sarah asked questions. The way her mother would sometimes stare off into the distance with a sadness that seemed too deep for words. The small inconsistencies in the stories about their family history that Sarah had always attributed to her mother's desire for privacy. She told you your father was a businessman who died in a car accident when you were a baby, William said, and Sarah's heart clenched as she realized he knew the exact lie her mother had told. She created an entire fictional history to protect you from the truth, that your father was a coward who chose money over love, who abandoned both of you when you needed him most. Sarah's voice came out as a broken whisper. You knew where we were. All these years, you knew where we were. It wasn't a question, but a statement heavy with accusation and disbelief. The man lying before her, dying and frail, had possessed the power to change their lives completely, and he had chosen not to use it. I had investigators check on you periodically, William admitted, shame coloring every word. I knew when you started school, when you graduated high school, when you got your teaching degree. I knew when your mother was diagnosed with diabetes, knew when she was struggling to pay her medical bills while putting you through college. And every single time, I told myself that interfering would only make things worse, that you were better off without the complications that came with being connected to the Morrison name. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. While Sarah and her mother had struggled financially, clipping coupons and working multiple jobs just to make ends meet, William Morrison had been living in luxury, watching their struggles from afar like some distant, uninvolved observer. Sarah thought about all the nights her mother had fallen asleep at the kitchen table, exhausted from double shifts at the hospital, all the times they had eaten rice and beans for dinner, because it was all they could afford, all the dreams her mother had deferred so Sarah could have opportunities. Then why? Sarah's voice was stronger now, anger beginning to cut through the shock. Why are you telling me this now? Why put us through this pain when you're dying anyway? She stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the perfectly manicured gardens that probably cost more to maintain each month than her mother made in a year. William watched her with eyes that held decades of regret. Because 3 years ago, my son brought home a woman named Sarah Chun, and I thought I was seeing a ghost. You looked so much like your mother at that age that it took my breath away. But I told myself it was just a coincidence that Chun was a common surname, that I was seeing connections that didn't exist because of my own guilt. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with sickening clarity. Sarah turned back to face William, her eyes blazing with a fury that made her look remarkably like her mother in the old photograph. You had me investigated. You said you hired a private investigator when David brought me home. You were looking for evidence that I was a gold digger, but what you were really doing was confirming whether I was your daughter. The investigator's report included your mother's maiden name, her immigration records, your birth certificate, William confirmed, his voice growing weaker with the weight of his confession. Linda Chun, formerly Lynn Chun, arrived in the United States in 1995. Sarah Chun, born March 15, 1996, father listed as unknown. The timeline matched perfectly, and when I saw your school records, your test scores, your academic achievements, I knew you had inherited the Morrison intelligence along with your mother's compassion. Sarah felt sick to her stomach as the full scope of the deception became clear. So you've known for 3 years that I was your daughter, and you still treated me like I was some kind of threat to your family. You sat through our wedding, you watched David pledge his life to me, and you said nothing. You let me marry my own stepbrother. The horror of this realization hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Sarah had married David Morrison, the son of the man who had abandoned her and her mother before she was even born. The love story she had thought was a fairy tale was actually a nightmare of deception and abandonment that spanned nearly 3 decades. William's face went ashen as the words hung in the air between them, and for a moment Sarah thought he might have a heart attack right there in front of her. But then he shook his head with desperate urgency, his eyes wide with something that looked almost like relief mixed with panic. "No, Sarah, no. You don't understand. David isn't my biological son." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, and she stumbled backward until she felt the window frame against her back. Nothing made sense anymore. Everything she thought she knew about the Morrison family, about her own identity, about the man she had married, was crumbling around her like a house of cards. "What are you saying?" William struggled to sit up straighter in his bed, wincing with pain, but driven by the desperate need to make her understand before it was too late. David was adopted. My wife Margaret and I tried for years to have children, but we couldn't conceive. When David was 6 months old, his teenage mother gave him up for adoption through a private agency. We brought him home when he was barely walking, and he became our son in every way that mattered. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process this new information. If David was adopted, then they weren't related by blood. But the timeline was wrong. The story didn't make sense. That's impossible. David is 3 years older than me. If you knew my mother before I was born, if you abandoned her when she was pregnant, then David would have already been in your family. David came to us in 1995, Williams said quietly. The same year your mother disappeared from my life. The same year I threw myself into building the business to try to forget what I had lost. His voice broke as he continued. I convinced myself that adopting David was proof that I could be a good father, that I could love a child even if he wasn't my biological son. But the truth was, I was trying to replace the family I had destroyed through my own cowardice. The cruelty of the timing was staggering. While Lin Chun was struggling alone with a newborn baby, working multiple jobs, and facing discrimination as a single immigrant mother, William Morrison was playing father to an adopted son and telling himself he was a good man. While Sarah was growing up without a father, believing he had died tragically, David was being raised in luxury as the heir to a fortune that should have been partially hers. Margaret never knew about you or your mother, William continued, his voice growing weaker as the emotional toll of his confession drained what little strength he had left. I convinced myself that what she didn't know couldn't hurt her, that I was protecting everyone by keeping the secret. But when she died 5 years ago, I realized I'd spent our entire marriage living a lie. Sarah thought about Margaret Morrison, the elegant woman who had always been kind to her in their brief interactions. She had died of cancer when Sarah and David were still dating, and Sarah remembered how devastated David had been, how he had spoken of his mother with such love and respect. Now she wondered if Margaret would have felt differently about the family. She thought she knew if she had learned the truth about her husband's past. "Why didn't you tell David the truth about his adoption?" Sarah asked, her voice hoarse with emotion. Throughout their relationship, David had always spoken about being a Morrison as if it were his birthright, had talked about carrying on his father's legacy and inheriting the responsibility that came with the family name. The revelation that he was adopted would shatter his understanding of his own identity. "Because I'm a coward," Williams said simply, and there was no self-pity in his voice, just stark acknowledgement of his own failures. The same cowardice that made me choose money over love 30 years ago made me choose the comfortable lie over the difficult truth. David grew up believing he was my biological son, believing that the Morrison legacy was his birthright. How could I tell him that everything he thought he knew about himself was false? Sarah moved back to the chair beside William's bed, her legs too weak to support her any longer. The weight of 3 decades of lies and secrets was crushing, but beneath the shock and anger, she was beginning to understand the full scope of what William was trying to tell her. "The inheritance," she said slowly. "That's what this is really about, isn't it?" William nodded, reaching again into the envelope with trembling hands. I've rewritten my will 17 times in the past 3 years, ever since I confirmed who you really were. I've wrestled with how to make things right without destroying David, without exposing secrets that would hurt everyone involved. But lying here, facing death, I realized that some truths are too important to take to the grave. He pulled out a legal document, thick with official seals and signatures. This is my final will and testament, signed last week with my lawyer present. David will inherit the business and the house, as he always expected. But there's a trust fund that's been growing for 28 years, a fund I set up the day I learned your mother was pregnant, hoping that someday I would find the courage to do the right thing. Sarah stared at the document, afraid to touch it, afraid to learn what other revelations it might contain. The number written on the summary page made her gasp. It was more money than she could have imagined, more than she and her mother could spend in several lifetimes. But all she could think about was how different their lives would have been if William had found his courage 28 years ago, instead of waiting until he was dying to ease his conscience. Sarah's hands trembled as she finally reached for the will, her eyes scanning the legal language that would change everything about her future. But as the reality of what she was holding began to sink in, the anger that had been building inside her finally erupted. She stood up abruptly, throwing the document back onto William's bed with such force that the pages scattered across the expensive bed sheets. "You think money fixes this?" Her voice was raw with emotion, tears streaming down her face as 3 decades of injustice crystallized into pure rage. "You think a trust fund makes up for my mother working herself to the bone while you lived in luxury? You think money erases the nights she cried herself to sleep, wondering if she had made the right choices for me?" William flinched as if she had struck him, but he didn't look away from her fury. Perhaps this was what he had been expecting, what he deserved after a lifetime of choosing the easy path over the right one. "Sarah, I know I can't undo the past, but I want to try to make things right." "Right." Sarah laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the quiet room. "There is no making this right. Do you know what my mother sacrificed for me? She gave up her dreams of becoming a doctor because she couldn't afford medical school as a single mother. She worked double shifts at the hospital while going to nursing school at night, sleeping 3 hours a night for years just so she could provide for me. She never dated, never remarried, never had any life of her own because she was too busy being both parents to the daughter you abandoned." The machines beside William's bed seemed to beep faster, responding to the stress of the confrontation, but Sarah was beyond caring about his fragile condition. The grief and rage she had been suppressing her entire life without knowing it was pouring out of her like a dam had burst. "She's dying too, you know. The diabetes she developed from years of stress and poor nutrition, because she was spending all her money on my education instead of healthy food. The woman who sacrificed everything for me is dying in a small apartment while her baby's father lies in a mansion, finally ready to acknowledge her existence." William's face was pale, but his eyes were fixed on Sarah with an intensity that suggested he was absorbing every word of her accusations. Is Lynn in pain?" The question came out as barely a whisper, and Sarah could see that beneath the guilt, there was still love there, still a tenderness for the woman he had lost so many years ago. "Her name is Linda now, remember? The name she chose when she decided to reinvent herself to give me a better life in your country." Sarah's voice dripped with sarcasm. "And yes, she's in pain. Physical pain from the complications of her diabetes. Emotional pain from a lifetime of wondering what she did wrong to drive away the man she loved. She still keeps a picture of you in her jewelry box, hidden under her old nursing school certificates. She thinks I don't know about it, but I've seen her looking at it sometimes, and the expression on her face breaks my heart." William's composure finally cracked completely, and he began to sob with the desperate grief of a man who had spent 30 years running from his own conscience. "I loved her, Sarah. I love her more than I've ever loved anyone in my life. But I was weak, and I was scared, and I made choices that I've regretted every single day since." "Then why didn't you come back?" Sarah demanded, moving closer to the bed, her anger making her fearless in the face of this man who had intimidated her for so long. Why didn't you fight for her? Why didn't you choose love over money when it actually mattered? Because I was a coward, William repeated, and this time the words seemed to cost him everything he had left. Because I convinced myself that she was better off without me, that you were better off without the complications that came with the Morrison name. Because I was terrified that if I tried to come back into your lives, I would only bring you more pain. Sarah stared at him, seeing not the powerful businessman who had built an empire, but a broken old man who had spent 3 decades paying the price for his cowardice. The anger was still there, would probably always be there, but underneath it was something she hadn't expected: pity. You know what the worst part is? She still loves you. After everything you put her through, after 30 years of raising your daughter alone, she still talks about you like you were the great love of her life who was tragically taken from her. The revelation hit William like a physical blow, and Sarah could see the machines registering his distress as his heart rate spiked. She taught me that love means sacrifice, that it means putting the people you care about before yourself, that it means staying and fighting even when things get difficult. Sarah's voice was quieter now, but no less intense. Everything I know about love, I learned from watching her be the parent you couldn't be. And now you want to give me money as if that somehow honors her sacrifice or makes up for your absence. William struggled to reach for her hand, his fingers cold and weak against her skin. Sarah, please. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I know money can't fix what I've broken. But your mother raised an extraordinary woman, and I want to make sure that you and she have everything you need, that you never have to struggle the way she did. Sarah looked down at his hand holding hers, this connection to the father she had never known, and felt the complexity of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Part of her wanted to pull away, to reject everything he was offering out of loyalty to her mother and anger at the years of abandonment. But another part of her, the part that had inherited his intelligence and her mother's compassion, recognized that this moment was bigger than just her own pain. Sarah sat in silence for a long moment, her hand still held in William's frail grip, as the weight of everything she had learned settled around them like dust after an explosion. The anger was still there, burning in her chest like a coal that would probably never fully extinguish, but she was beginning to understand that this moment was about more than just her own pain. It was about her mother, who had spent 30 years believing that the man she loved had simply been too proud to fight for their family. It was about David, who would soon learn that his entire understanding of his own identity was built on a foundation of lies. And it was about William himself, a man who had spent 3 decades imprisoned by his own cowardice and was finally trying to find some measure of redemption before death claimed him. There's something else you need to know, William said, his voice so weak now that Sarah had to lean close to hear him. The night before your mother left me, she told me she was pregnant. She begged me to choose her, to choose our family over my father's money. And I promised her I would find a way to make it work, that I would stand up to my father and fight for our future together. His eyes closed as if the memory was too painful to bear. But when morning came, and I was standing in my father's office with the ultimatum hanging in the air, I chose the money. I chose a safe path. And by the time I realized what I had lost, it was too late. Sarah felt her heart breaking not just for herself and her mother, but for the love story that could have been, for the family that should have existed, for the 30 years of happiness that had been sacrificed on the altar of fear and social expectations. She waited for you, Sarah whispered. For months after I was born, she kept thinking you would come back, that you would realize what you had given up and fight for us. I know, William said, and the knowledge seemed to be killing him more surely than the cancer eating away at his body. I drove by her apartment building dozens of times, sat in my car outside her work, wrote letters I never sent. But I kept telling myself that she was better off without me, that I would only bring her more pain if I tried to force my way back in her life. Sarah thought about her mother's small apartment, the way Linda had always kept fresh flowers on the kitchen table, even when money was tight, the way she had sung lullabies in both English and Chinese, to help Sarah feel connected to both sides of her heritage. She named me Sarah because she said it meant princess, and she wanted me to know that I was royalty even if we didn't have money. She said my father would have wanted me to feel like I deserved the best things in life. William's grip on her hand tightened, and she could see tears streaming down his weathered face. She was right. You are royalty, Sarah. You're the daughter of the strongest, most courageous woman I've ever known, and you've grown up to be everything I hoped you would be and more. When I watch you with David, when I see how you love him without reservation or calculation, I see your mother's heart in you. The mention of David brought Sarah back to the present crisis with sharp clarity. Her husband, her adopted stepbrother, she corrected herself with dark irony, was expecting her home for dinner, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire world was about to be turned upside down. What are we going to tell David? How do we explain that his wife is his adopted sister, that his father has been lying to him his entire life? We tell him the truth, William said with more strength than he had shown all afternoon. All of it. He deserves to know who he really is, just like you deserve to know who your real father was. And then we trust that the love you have for each other is strong enough to survive the shock of learning that it was built on a foundation of lies and coincidences. Sarah stood up and walked to the window again, looking out at the gardens where she had imagined her children might someday play, before she learned that those children would carry the genetic legacy of this complicated, broken family. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded her of the sunsets she used to watch with her mother from their small apartment balcony. I need to see her, Sarah said suddenly. I need to tell my mother that I know the truth, that her secret is finally out in the open. William nodded, understanding immediately what she meant. Will you tell her that I never stopped loving her? That not a day has passed in 30 years when I haven't thought about what my life might have been like if I had been brave enough to choose love over fear. Sarah turned back to face him, this man who was both stranger and father, enemy and ally, the source of her greatest pain and potentially her family's salvation. I'll tell her, she promised. But William, this money, this inheritance, I can't just take it without her blessing. She's the one who paid the real price for your choices. She's the one who deserves to decide what comes next. Then bring her here, William said, his voice urgent with the desperation of a dying man who had finally found something worth fighting for. Bring Linda here so I can apologize to her face, so I can tell her what she means to me before it's too late, so I can ask for her forgiveness and try to make amends for the 30 years I stole from all of us. As Sarah looked at William Morrison, seeing not the intimidating businessman who had made her feel unwelcome for 3 years, but the broken man who had spent decades paying for his cowardice, she realized that this story was far from over. There would be difficult conversations ahead, painful revelations that would shake the foundation of everything she and David thought they knew about their lives. There would be questions about their marriage, about their future, about whether love could survive the shock of learning it was built on such an elaborate web of secrets and lies. But for the first time since she had walked into this room, Sarah felt something that might have been hope. Her mother would finally get the apology she deserved, the acknowledgement that her love had been real and worthy. David would learn the truth about his identity, painful as it might be. And Sarah herself would finally understand where she came from, who she really was, and what her place in this complicated family was meant to be. The money was secondary to these deeper truths, but it would ensure that her mother's remaining years would be comfortable, that the woman who had sacrificed everything for love would finally receive something in return. The story that had begun with abandonment and cowardice was ending with truth and the possibility of redemption. It wouldn't erase the 30 years of struggle and separation, but it might, finally, allow all of them to move forward with honesty instead of living in the shadow of secrets that had poisoned 3 decades of their lives.